Welcome to East End Library's Twomey Series and Biography as Pilgrimage on the Trail of Peter Matthiessen. This event is co-sponsored by the Peter Matthiessen Center and Danielle Turner. Our speaker today is Lance Richardson. His new book, True Nature, The Pilgrimage of Peter Matthiessen, is on sale, as we just discussed, and has been extremely well reviewed. His previous book was House of Nutter, the Rebel Taylor of Savile Row, which won many awards, including the New York Times Editor's Choice. He has been awarded numerous fellowships, including a year-long residency at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. He teaches in the MFA in Writing program at Bennington College, Vermont. Lance will also be available tomorrow night through the Peter Matthiessen Center at the Ram's Head Inn for a fireside chat and dinner. There are flyers for that event in the back if you are interested in joining. While you're here, please enjoy the framed photos in the gallery from the Men's Lives project, which Peter Matthiessen also was involved in. Thank you.
Wow, thanks for coming, everyone. Just get my time going here. So before I start talking, I thought I would read a very small section of the book, very small, just to kind of give you a taste of true nature. So I'm going to read a little bit, just a couple of paragraphs about when Peter arrived in the Hamptons in 1953. So when he moved back here after living in Paris. Okay, so here we go. At the start of September, Peter drove Patsy and Luke 100 miles east, almost to the end of Long Island. I'm going to put my hand up when it's a quote, so you can differentiate between him and me. I don't feel too easy at home, and am happier away, which is why I formed an almost unnatural attachment to East Hampton in place of home. For there I can start from scratch and be natural, for no one can interpret my words or actions according to the past. He had written these lines about East Hampton in 1946, but they remain true 7 years later. If home, meaning New York City as much as Stamford, Connecticut, was contaminated by a long history of familial drama and suffocating social constraints, then the East End of Long Island felt like neutral ground. Here was a tranquil territory that he would one day rhapsodize in a book called Men's Lives. Matthiessen did not stop in the village of East Hampton with its clipped privet hedges and residences which, in Patsy's word, would have tempted Gatsby. He pushed a few miles further northeast into the hamlet of Springs, located in a tangle of scrub oaks and pitch pines near the tidal marsh of Sagaponack Harbor. Once the domain of a tribe known as the Sagaponacks, by 1953 Springs was home to fewer than 700 people, many of whom could trace their ancestry back to the fishermen farmers who built their houses there in the 17th and 18th century, and who, for their proud self-sufficiency and peculiar dialect, had owned the title Bonacks, i.e. Bonackers. Unlike East Hampton, Springs was not a prosperous place. Many of the residents were dirt poor, although they rarely thought of themselves that way because they could gather almost everything they needed from the land. The poorest person, in my opinion, is the one who in an emergency or everyday life can do actually nothing, declared Ferris Talmadge of Bonacker, summing up the ethos of his people. Some of their houses had been built with mortar made from ground-up shells, sand, and handles of cow hair. In the old days, they dragged ice from the ponds using long-toothed saws and horses, and sometimes paid the doctors in vegetables or milk. Yet to many members of the summer crowd who frequented East Hampton, the Bonackers were rednecks, or cousins of cousins, and all named Talmadge, Bennett, King, Parsons, Miller, or Lester. Springs was spoken of as below the bridge, or on the wrong side of the tracks. Literally, the Long Island Railroad bisected the community. To the Bonackers, the village of East Hampton was upstreet, and the colony consisted of people from away. The artists who had started to move into Springs were also people from away. It took many years not to be from away. Matthiessen rented a rustic cottage on Springs Fireplace Road, just west of a horse and cattle farm owned by George Sid Miller. Years later, he would recall the setting as a peaceful and very pretty place of meadowlands and cedar fields and a quiet lead of water widening out eastward past Tick Island to the sand spit at Louse Point in Gardiner's Bay. In her recollection, Patsy would focus on the derelict house across the road. It was like a welfare house. The place was all full of old shoes and overcoats. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Oh, Peter. So I thought I'd start my talk today after the reading just then, actually with this book here, which some of you might recognize. So this is the book that got me into this whole mess in the first place, The Snow Leopard. Okay. About 15 years ago in Australia, a friend handed me a beat-up penguin paperback of The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen, and she suggested I read it. I was a nomad at the time, a travel writer, and predisposed to existential funks about being and nothingness. And my friend thought I might find something therapeutic in this book. Anyway, I opened it one day and I started reading. I'm just going to read you the very first paragraph so you can hear Peter's voice. In late September of 1973, I set out with GS on a journey to the Crystal Mountain, walking west under Annapurna and north along the Kali and Gandaki River, then west and north again around the Dhaulagiri Peaks and across the Kanjaroba 250 miles or more to the land of Dolpo on the Tibetan Plateau. GS refers to George Schaller, the famous wildlife zoologist, and the expedition that he's referring to there is a wildlife survey to study populations of Baro, or the Himalayan blue sheep. So these blue sheep live in a remote valley of a monastery called Shea Gompa, or the Crystal Monastery. And Dr. Schaller wanted to observe the blue sheep in their natural habitat, and maybe he hoped he would also catch sight of the snow leopard, which was a natural predator of the Baro. So Schaller had met Peter Matthiessen years before in the Serengeti, and he invited the writer along on this journey which promised to be long and arduous for a bit of company. So I read this and it all seemed pretty standard to me when you sort of begin the book. But then Matthiessen describes this scientific expedition as a true pilgrimage, a journey of the heart. He admits that his wife has recently died of cancer. He is a new student of Zen Buddhism. He too is inclined to existential funks about being in nothingness. I read on and realized that the titular snow leopard refers not just to the elusive big cat of the Himalayas, but to something more abstract. Seeing the snow leopard for Matthiessen is an elegant metaphor for achieving enlightenment. This book dazzled me when I was in my mid-20s, but it took me a long time to pinpoint why. I think sometimes when we read a book that really resonates, we have this sort of emotional reaction to it, but we can't necessarily really pinpoint exactly what it is about it that makes us feel that way. But one of the jobs of a writer is really to push through that inarticulacy and find the right words. So I did, after a couple of years of thinking about this book, and I came to the conclusion that what struck me is the same thing that I think has struck so many readers over the past 5 decades, that the book has attained the status of a modern classic. It is steeped in science and spirituality. Matthiessen moves between these seemingly incompatible modes of thought with startling ease. So you have sentences like this one. The basio-occipital bone at the base of the skull is goat-like, and so are the large dew claws and the prominent markings on the foreside of the legs. And that sort of sentence, which is obviously very scientific, shares spaces with sentences like this one. I know this mountain because I am this mountain. Matthiessen had no problem roaming from physics to the Vedas or from ornithology to metaphysics. And, indeed, he believed that this kind of voracious open-mindedness was necessary if, and I quote, we are going to survive. He was talking as a long-time observer of the violence being inflicted by man on the natural world. He understood that our fragmented and compartmentalized culture was condemning us all to a grim future. So he sought other ways of seeing that might shake us out of our blind destructiveness. I came to think about Peter Matthiessen as a poet-scientist or the mystical naturalist. So back in 2017, I had finished my first book, House of Nada, and I started to cast around for a new project. And here's a valuable piece of advice that was once given to me by one of my old professors. If you can talk yourself out of an idea, you shouldn't do it. And I managed to talk myself out of every idea except for a book about Peter Matthiessen. I couldn't shake it. I wanted to know how he had evolved this peculiar sensibility of science and spirituality, and I was really curious to find out if you'd ever find the enlightenment you'd gone looking for in the Himalayas. So during my early research, I came across the definition of pilgrimage that Peter Matthiessen once wrote. So these are his words here. A pilgrimage distinguishes itself from an ordinary journey by the fact that it does not follow a laid out plan or itinerary, that it does not pursue a fixed aim or a limited purpose, but that it carries its meaning in itself by relying on an inner urge which operates on two planes, on the physical as well as on the spiritual plane. It is a movement not only in the outer but equally in the inner space, a movement whose spontaneity is that of the nature of all life, i.e. of all that grows continually beyond its momentary form, a movement that always starts from an invisible inner core. So a good biography is more than just a chronology of somebody's life. You know, they did this, then they did this, then they did this. You always want some sort of animating questions or sort of a query that is guiding you through the process. And for me, it was really this. I wanted to write a book that would trace Mathiessen's life along these two planes that he's describing here. So there's the physical plane, what he did in his life, where he went, who he met, and then there's the sort of spiritual plane, the restless search for a sense of wholeness, or what he once called transcendental liberation. So the pilgrimage of Peter Matthiessen became my subtitle, and the main title, True Nature, gestures as his reputation as one of our preeminent nature writers, but it's really derived from Zen. So to achieve enlightenment is to pierce in Zen, is to pierce the delusion that is an individual ego and apprehend one's Buddha nature or one's true nature. So this really was a lifelong obsession for Matthiessen, and he eventually became a Zen Roshi. So early on in the process, I'm finding all this material, but I decided that my trek, my book rather, was going to involve a recreation of the Snow Leopard trek. I was going to walk across the Himalayas and go to Sagaponack. I wanted to see this monastery that he visited and understand why it was so significant to his personal development. And I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do this, but I told my editor, it's going to happen, fine, figure it out, and bought the book, and then I have to work out how to actually do it. So this is a map from Google Maps, and I've very elegantly drawn a circle, as you can see. So Dolpo is the region of Nepal where Matthiessen and Charlotte trekked in 1973, and at that time it had been closed to outsiders for years because camper guerrillas were using the area as a hideout while they fought the Chinese over Tibet, which is just across the border. You can see the large border there. So that's Tibet to the north. So Dolpo opened for a brief window in the early 1970s, which allowed the expedition to occur, but then it closed again. And it remained almost entirely inaccessible to outsiders until the start of the 1990s. So even in 2017, when I started this project, it was not an easy thing to go there. You fly from Kathmandu, which you can see all the restaurants that I've starred. Kathmandu to Nepalgunj, and then from Nepalgunj, which is down near the border of India, through mountains that are literally, you could look out the side of the plane and see the mountains higher than you, which is very intimidating. And you land in a little village called Jafal, and then you sort of land on an airstrip that ends in a sudden drop, so you hope that they actually do stop the plane. Because of the narrowness of the valleys in this part of the Himalayas, everything is on foot, and you walk for days, crisscrossing rapids and hugging sheer cliffs, all the way to Ringmo, a village on the shore of Fuxundo Lake. You can see there's a lake there in the middle, sort of like a Y-shaped lake. To go beyond the lake, however, you need to traverse a scribble of trail high above the lake's western shore, and then you ascend a steep canyon all the way to 17,550 feet, crossing at a place in the clouds called the Kangla. Past the Kangla is the valley of Shea Gompa, the crystal monastery down below the crystal mountain, and it's called that because there's quartz scattered all over the ground. So everything up to Fuxundo Lake is known as Lower Dolpo, and I marked it here on the map as red. Okay, so everything in red there is relatively easy to visit. You can get package tours, you can go there if you want. But everything past the lake that's in purple there requires a very expensive permit, and there really are no tours that go there, so you have to pretty much mount an expedition. So how, in God's name, was I going to get to the Crystal Mountain and the Crystal Monastery, which is at the very top of this map here? In an amazing stroke of luck, I found a Scotsman named Gavin Anderson, who runs a small non-profit trekking company called Nomadic Skies. And Gavin's background is in development in Uganda, and he now works with local communities around the world, a couple of countries, to set up sustainable tourism initiatives. And one of the communities he works with happens to be in Lower Dolpo. So I found Gavin and I called him up and I was just asking for advice. I was like, do you have any tips about how I'm going to get to this very remote monastery? And Gavin said, I'll take you. And I kind of locked him in before he could change his mind, because I knew that if he really thought about it, he'd regret it. And he probably did, but too bad, as we went. So that's Gavin and me. So we started organizing this really absurd venture in 2019, and it cost many thousands of dollars, and COVID delayed our plans multiple times. But I finally flew to Kathmandu in May 2022. We were joined by an English photographer, James Appleton, a guide named Norbu Lama, and another guide from Dolpo named Galpo. We hired 4 local lads to run our kitchen tent. They spent most of the time recording videos for TikTok. And we also had 5 mules that came from Jaffa, and they carried most of our supplies, including, and this figure was given to me by Gavin, 330 pounds of popcorn, coriander seeds, coconut, turmeric powder, almonds, and rice. And that was it. And on May 15, 2022, we set out to walk several 100 miles, 150 miles, whatever it was, to the Crystal Monastery, in the footsteps of George Schaller and Peter Matthiessen. Instead of describing this journey we took, I asked James, the photographer, who had taken a drone with him, if he would give me some footage, and he sent me a Hollywood film trailer, which I'm going to play for you now. So this is our walk to the Crystal Monastery. So it turns out walking across the Himalayas is pretty hard. Yes. So quite early in the trek, I developed a cough and I started finding blood in my nose. And by the time we actually reached the Crystal Monastery, there was a rattle in my chest and I was spluttering so badly that I was keeping the whole camp awake at night. One morning I caught Gavin listening to classical music in his tent. He was trying to calm himself down because he was very worried about the idea that I was about to have some sort of serious medical episode that would require a helicopter evacuation. But because of my symptoms, we decided to leave earlier than we had planned. So I kind of touched the monastery and then we had to sort of leave very quickly. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there was also some post-trek drama. So as we kind of got lower, I recovered my lung capacity. But after we got home, I got an email one day from Gavin, and he said that James had been on antibiotics because he had giardia, and the antibiotics had upset the enormous tapeworm that apparently he'd also picked up, that then exited his body in a scene worthy of David Cronenberg, and I was advised to go and maybe get checked out as well. So I went to the doctor immediately that same day, and I did not have a tapeworm, but I had another microscopic parasite that required a nuclear bomb of antibiotics, so we brought back souvenirs. But it was worth it. I would do it all again. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever done in my life. But it was not the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. A cradle-to-grave biography is a different type of expedition, far lonelier and much longer in duration. So I'm going to spend the rest of my talk today talking about this other expedition that I went on and what I learned while writing True Nature. Okay, but first, who was this man? And I'm sure some of you in this room knew him or know who he is, but I want to give a little bit of a glimpse of who he was. Not by, well, let me just sort of say, first of all, he was born in 1927. He was a novelist and a naturalist, a social and environmental activist. He was an early proponent of the modern environmental movement. He was also the only person to ever win the National Book Award for fiction and non-fiction. But I don't want to spend the next 10 minutes just giving you his CV. So I thought what might be interesting is just give you a couple of little glimpses from his life, little sort of snapshots, to kind of gesture at the breadth and complexity of this guy here. So let's go. Number one. In 1960, when Matthiessen was traveling through the Peruvian Amazon as a writer for The New Yorker, he heard a rumor in a bar, a backcountry watering hole, of a giant prehistoric fossil lying unclaimed in the jungle near a tributary of the Urubamba River. Based on this rumor alone, Matthiessen floated through rapids on a balsa wood raft. You can see the raft there. He floated through rapids on that raft. And if anyone's seen Fitzcarraldo, the Werner Herzog movie, he floated through those rapids on this raft, which is crazy. But he found the fossil. As you can see, that's the fossil. Okay, 2. As a Zen master, his name was Muryo Roshi, and Muryo comes from the 4 great Bodhisattva vows, and there's some Zen practitioners in the room, so I'm not even going to try to say that and embarrass myself. But basically, the third of the 4 great Bodhisattva vows, which is the one here, means, in Mathiessen's translation, realities are boundless, I vow to perceive them. And Muryo means boundless, so boundless Roshi. And that name was chosen because it was the vow that they were chanting in the hospital as his second wife died of cancer. So it had huge significance to him. 3, this photograph is very famous. I'm sure some of you recognize it. Frame 352 from the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film, shot in Northern California in 1967. So this is very famous, the Bigfoot, like that. Okay, so this is Peter recreating the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film in the exact same spot in 1976. And that's because Bigfoot and the Yeti were very important to him. Okay, 4. In the early 1950s, he co-founded the Paris Review while he was an undercover agent for the CIA, and that's him at the top of the stairs, and that's George Plimpton, just there at the bottom. So everyone focuses on the question of CIA funding for the Paris Review. The CIA had been slipping the money, but I think a more interesting question is, what was Peter doing that required him to have the cover in the first place? Well, he had made contact with a member of the French Communist Party, who he dubbed Monsieur X in some memoir notes. And Mr. X was a literary fellow, and to pump him for information, Peter came up with this scheme where he was going to create this fake novel, and then he was going to tell this guy about this fake novel and Monsieur X would help him craft the novel to make it more realistic. And this way he would be kind of getting little bits of information from this guy. So that's what he did, and his CIA minders were so excited by the intel he was getting that they wanted him to actually become a member of the French Communist Party, would basically become a mole. And Peter balked at that and quit the CIA because he was being followed, he and Patsy were being surveilled. But after they had left the CIA, he showed this fake novel to his friend Bill Styron, and Styron said, "This is a great novel, you should finish this." And so he did, and it became his second novel, Partisans, which is not a very good novel, but it's kind of interesting that it was, it originally started as a secret CIA project. Okay. 5. After his stint in Paris with the CIA, Peter moved here, as I read in that extract from my book, with his young family to the East End of Long Island. And they lived in Springs, but then they moved to a chauffeur's apartment on Stony Hill Farm. So Matthiessen started working with the Bonackers on Ted Lester's crew, and he did that for several seasons. And in his beloved book, Men's Lives, he recalled, this is him speaking, "The springtime filled me with well-being, despite my drowsiness, despite sore hands, despite the prospect of a long, hard day that, if we were lucky, would end long after dark in the cold freezer of Montauk seafood, hosing down and packing and icing bass." And when he was not hole-signing on the beaches, like you can see in this photograph here, he was scalloping or bird watching or running a charter boat business, Captain Matthiessen of the Merlin, and he later called this the best year-round working schedule that I ever devised. And lastly, 6. His writing about animals is legendary, and he particularly loved writing about birds. He loved birds. And in The Shorebirds of North America, there's this quote, and I think it's beautiful. "One has only to consider the life force packed tight into that puff of feathers to lay the mind wide open to the mysteries, the order of things, the why and the beginning." And that's really sort of an indication of how his mind worked. He'd sort of start from a tiny puff of feathers, and then he would scale up to these big questions about being in the infinite. So that's a very helter-skelter glimpse of Peter Matthiessen, non-chronological, but maybe it gives you an idea of the formidable task that I had on my hands with this biography. Okay, yeah, I can hear you laughing, Maria. You knew. Okay. If you're planning on writing a life, you're almost certainly going to spend a lot of time in archives around the country. And I basically became a hermit crab and moved from one archive to another, where I would be scavenging for treasures. And this is one of the treasures here that I found. I love this. So Peter dreamed as a young man of writing for the New Yorker, like many of us do. And he was extremely nervous, also like many of us, about submitting his work because he didn't think it was good enough. So he was so nervous that instead of actually submitting his work and getting a rejection letter, he just wrote his own rejection letter to save the magazine to trouble. So he was 18 at the time. He's still at Hotchkiss, as you can see from the letterhead here. And this is a letter to his girlfriend, but his writing is very hard to read, so I'm just going to read you the bit below the red line. So this is Peter, his own rejection letter to himself. "Dear kid, what are you trying to pull off anyhow? Here we are, trying to run a satirical sheet, and you freak little bastard, have to go and send in utter tripe like this. If I had my way, you'd be taken out and shot for wasting our precious time, dear. One more occurrence like this, and I'll write your father a letter to get me. Now go back to the nursery and dry off." So that's what he expected from the New Yorker. And I actually found his first genuine rejection from the New Yorker at the New York Public Library. So here it is. And he's 24 when this letter came. This is a letter from Catherine White, who's the famous fiction editor at the time in the New Yorker, and it's to Mathiessen's agent, Denise Baumgarten. So this is what his first rejection letter said. "We can't take Peter Mathiessen's Martin speech, but I'm glad to have read it. I agree with you that he has talent even while I think how very young and tragical this particular story is. It's the kind of story the young dream up, I guess, in lieu of any actual knowledge of tragedy on which to base a story, and yet has promise of good things to come. It's not quite as lacerating as the one Peter wrote himself, but it's pretty working. So the actual Peter Matthiessen papers held at the Harry Ransom Center down in Austin, Texas, and I went down to poke around a bit in 2018, at which point the archivist confessed that more than half the collection hadn't even been catalogued. So I ended up moving to Austin, and with my partner, we uprooted our lives and we went there, and it took nearly a year of 5-day-a-week days in the archive to go through what now feel to have now, of course, been cataloged after finished, 227 boxes. So some of them, when I was in there, still smelled of the mold in the attic that they had come out of, which is kind of amazing. And I could spend hours just going through the things that I found, but I just pulled out a few little nuggets. So this is a page of Mathiessen's Himalayas journal. This is when he was walking to Sagaponack. This is what he wrote in. And you can see on this photograph here, he's got the journal open on his knees, but then he's got a smaller notebook. And what he would do is he'd write in this small notebook, and then when he would pause, when they rested, he would transcribe his notes into this larger journal. But I wanted to show you this page so you could kind of feel sorry for me. I mean, this is what I have to deal with. But also so you can see how he worked. So the reason there's so much crossing out is because he was actually doing his initial pass of the Snow Leopard in the journal itself. So he's circling the bits that he likes and crossing out the bits that he doesn't like. So this is a journal of a different kind. This is his LSD journal. So Matthiessen was really at the forefront of psychedelics, and he took LSD dozens of times in the 1960s for therapy. And as he was taking it, he'd write down his discoveries about himself in the moment, so minute by minute sometimes. So in this page here, you can see at the bottom it says, Ray Christ PM is you. And I think this is really interesting because Ray is actually one of the main characters in his novel Far Tortuga. So he seems to be having some sort of epiphany here about the fact that the character in his novel is actually himself. But I'm not sure if this would constitute a good trip or a bad trip. His handwriting gets pretty wild at the bottom there. So this is a sample of Bigfoot hair that somebody sent him, and the post-it says, I believe this to be a hairball. And it's hard to overestimate how important Bigfoot and the Yeti would become to his thinking, but you'll have to read the book if you want to know more, because I'm very sick of talking about Bigfoot at this point. Okay, and I also wanted to shout out, because we're here, I wanted to shout out the extraordinary archives here in this building. The East Hampton Library has troves of local history, and I worked with the lovely Andrea Meyer to dig out gems from the East Hampton Maritime Folklife collection. And I'm just going to quickly share just a little extract from an interview between Anson Prohaska and the Bonacker Milton Miller. And in this interview, Miller is recalling a time, he worked on Ted Lester's fishing crew as well, and he's recalling a time when they accidentally caught a porpoise in their net. And while Captain Ted was taking his gear home, the rest of the crew cut up the porpoise and took it home to eat it. And then this is Milton Miller, okay. And obviously I'm not going to get the accent right, you just have to imagine it, but I think this is wonderful, okay. So this is Milt. Time Ted come back, there was nothing there but the carcass. Holy Jesus, you talk about mad. Wasn't he mad? I'm sitting there eating at my table, knock comes on the door. Before I got up, he was in the house. Where the hell is that porpoise? I said, I got out there in the back entry. Well, by Jesus, you ain't gonna have all of it, he says. I'm gonna have some of it. So he cut off a big hunk of liver like this, and he took some. Gosh sakes, he said, you guys are nothing but goddamn thieves. He went down to Henry Haven, another crew member. He went to everyone. He goddamn near that whole fish back. I love that, and it's such a beautiful collection of like these men speaking in their sort of it's such a memorable way of talking, and you read these transcripts and it just evokes a whole time and a whole life. And I really recommend that if anyone has time to go and dig into these collections, because they're really special. Okay, so research for a biography rarely ends in the archives. To write about a man who was famous for his travel, I went to Texas, California, South Dakota. I spent days at a Zen monastery in the Catskill Mountains, and I waded through an onrushing tide in the Florida Everglades that threatened a rental car. But I think the strangest place I visited for research was actually Sagaponack, just down the road. So Peter, in 1960, bought a house, a property, and his family sold it after he died in 2014. And when they sold it, the new owners took a tree that they liked, and then they left the rest of the house and the land to go fallow, to sort of fall into disrepair. So I visited in 2018 with Peter's son Alex, who's sitting right here. And so these are some photographs. So for the 4 years before we arrived, the weeds had grown wild, raccoons had moved into the house, and mold had covered the zendo that Peter had built in a converted horse stable. And it was like getting a glimpse of the world if we all vanished tomorrow and it just all sort of went back to the wild. So this is Matthiessen in his writing studio, which was a converted child's playhouse at the back of the property. And you can see the photo next to it is what it looked like when I went there in 2018. And when we went there, all that I found inside was a poster of the Sasquatch, there it is again, and an old issue of the Paris Review that contained a craft interview that Matthiessen had done. And everything else had gone back to nature, which I thought was really beautiful. I know Maria does not agree, but I think it's pretty on point for Peter that that's what happened. So I interviewed more than 200 people for this book. I spoke to Mathiessen's friends, family, colleagues, editors, lovers, students, historians, scientists, lawyers, Zen teachers, a former CIA agent, and Mathiessen's dog walker. I even spoke to Leonard Peltier, the Native American activist in a maximum security prison. I somehow managed to track down his first 2 girlfriends, who Matthiessen had been dating simultaneously, and neither of them knew at the time. And one of these women invited me over to her grand apartment in New York, in Manhattan, and she told me all about their whirlwind romance in the 1940s. And then she opened a locket and she took out this tiny photograph of Peter that she insisted I take. It was taken in 1946 in Georgia. This woman, they owned this big sort of plantation house that actually was the house that inspired the house in Gone with the Wind. So that's where this was taken. So I had this wonderful interview with this woman. And I liked her very much, and a few days later, she called me up and she said, Lance, you have to come back, I've got all this really important stuff to tell you. So I went back to her house and we sat down, and she told me all about their whirlwind romance in the 1940s, everything she told me. And I was like, okay, great, we went over it again. And then I went away, and then I got a letter from her saying, Lance, I've got all this stuff I've got to tell you. So I went back and we sat down, and she told me all about the whirlwind romance in the 1940s. And after the 3rd time, her housekeeper came up to me and said, thank you, no one comes to visit her. And so I found that kind of heartbreaking, but she unfortunately passed last year or the year before, and she was so lovely. And I still exchange letters and emails with some of these women. And one of them is Peter's other first girlfriend, Wendy Burden, who's in her late 90s now. So I went to see Wendy in Washington, D.C. Wendy Morgan is her name now. And we had a chat about Peter, and she'd started seeing him in 1944. That letter from Hotchkiss was to Wendy. And at the end of our interview, she casually asked me if I wanted this, and she hands over a bag of about 120 letters that he had written her from Pearl Harbor in the 1940s, and he was 18 at the time, and these letters were incredible insight, not just into his development as a person and as a writer, and what he's thinking about the sort of authors that are publishing at that time, but also as an insight into what it was like to be in Pearl Harbor when the war was winding down and all of these soldiers were being demobilized. So it was an incredible find. And I arranged to Wendy to have them donated to her ransom center, so those letters are now protected. And you can see this is one of the letters here, and this is Peter actually, just there. This is in Pearl Harbor, this is in Honolulu. And all the letters look like this. They're all like amazing stationery. It's so sad that we don't write letters anymore. Look at this, how beautiful it is. Okay, but unquestionably the most important person that I spoke to for this book was Maria Matthiessen, Peter's widow, and Maria's here today. I don't want to embarrass Maria too much, but I do need to acknowledge that Maria was the first person I interviewed way back in 2017, November, so I guess that's 8 years ago this month. I drove to Sag Harbor for tea, and I was pretty nervous. There's an episode of This American Life about Maria called The 7 Things You're Not Supposed to Talk About. And I was very worried that I was going to accidentally talk about how I slept, or my health. What else is here? What else can't I speak about? Any of the things, aches and pains. And I was worried that I was going to offend her by making a mistake. But of course, Maria turned out to be wonderful, even when she was correcting my grammar. She gave me her blessing for the project, and she told me that, however, that I was insane to take it on because of the scope of it. Did I have any idea what I was getting into? And the truth is that I didn't. I had no idea what I was getting into. But one of the things that got me through the next 8 years was her continuing support, and every now and then I would go and visit her to go through the family photo albums. And Maria and I would have long talks, always over tea, and she became a good friend. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Maria, for allowing me to tell a story that belongs just as much to you as it does to Peter. And thanks to the whole Matthiessen clan. Rue and Alex are here today as well, and this book only exists in its current state because of their trust. This is the Mathiessens here. And I'm going to end there. Thank you so much. You have to do it because they're recording it, so yeah.
After the medical experience in the Himalayas, did you find the overall experience uplifting, life-changing, and altering in any way?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When you started to finish, did you have an internal epiphany?
Well, so it was an incredible experience, and for me, in terms of the book project, what it helped me understand is Peter had this idea of an island, he called it the island, where a space that he could be in, where you could sort of strip away the incrustations of society and all of the obligations and expectations and kind of be a child again, or like be yourself. And for him, Shagon with the Crystal Monastery was one of those places, and the weeks that he spent there were the happiest in his life. And so I was only there for like 24 hours, 48 hours, like not even 48 hours, but I felt like I understood why that space had meant so much to me. You feel like you're touching the sky, it's so high up there, and so elemental, and sort of in many ways just unchanged for centuries. And I felt like I got it, I understood why that space was really important. So for me, it was really important for the project to go there, even if I got very sick. It was worth it.
Who was the biggest character you met while researching? Was it the Sasquatch?
Oh
or
gosh.
someone down in Florida?
Biggest character. I mean, there's all sorts of characters. The guy who got all the Bigfoot stuff, who really incited all the Bigfoot stuff, he's passed now, so I feel like I can tell the story. He was a monk at a monastery, or like a little temple in Hollywood. And I called him one day, and he was really shocked that his letters were in a public archive. I think he thought they had just disappeared. And I was talking to him, and he still believes that the Bigfoot was out there, and he was very worried that I would disclose the location. So I had to reassure him that I would be vague about the directions that I gave in the book, about where they went looking for the Bigfoot, because he was very worried that it was an endangered species, and that if I put the coordinates in the book, someone would find Bigfoot. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
I really.
Did you find yourself to have gone on a bit of a pilgrimage with this, and starting off in one way and then coming to the end of it and feeling differently?
I'm a lot grayer now. I'm a lot more prepared. I mean, absolutely. I started this book when I was like 33, and now I'm like 41. So it's almost a decade of my life, and I sort of changed what I went on a real pilgrimage was like my feelings about him as a person and an artist, and I felt that I had even more respect for him as an artist than I did when I started. I think he's an extraordinary writer. And so my appreciation for him as an artist only grew through the project as I read more of his work and understood the process and the kind of the blood, sweat, and tears that it took to write the books. As a person, I think I came to feel much more ambivalently about him, and that he's a pretty complicated guy, and that it was a journey. I had moments where, like, you spend so much time with your subjects when you're writing a biography that they almost become like you're almost in a relationship with them in a strange way. And there were moments where I was, where I was so excited because he's sort of defending the American people doing something really righteous. And then there are other moments where I'm really frustrated. I just want to like shake him. I was like, why are you doing this? Yeah, it was a journey.
I'm making my way through the book. It's lovely.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. I had a question for you about writing about a writer. And
I don't recommend it.
I can't imagine doing that. What was it like going back to a time where very few people could write? And this is a person who wrote and began writing at a time where it was very exclusive as a craft, at least to be able to get published. And now it's much more open field and we have so much more opportunities to express. I'm curious what you saw of that age, and did you ever feel, I wish I was there for this particular reason, or was there anything that made you want to go back in time and be a writer back then?
I mean, I think it's wonderful that writing has become more democratic and that anyone can get into it. I think that's really important. But when you read about what it used to be like to work with an editor back in the 70s, like the level of attention, and Matthiessen, his editor used to come out to Sagaponack and would sit next to him in his writing studio and they'd go through page after page. You don't get that now. Like you're lucky to get any attention at all. So like there was like this interesting subplot through this book of like the changing landscape of writing and the publishing industry. And absolutely, like I have nostalgia for a time that I missed because I'm too young. But in terms of like access for people, I don't think it's better now than it ever was.
Yes?
Yeah.
What's your theory about how Peter evolved into the Peter that you were talking about now? I mean, background, childhood.
Yeah, I mean, my theory is this book. You have to like 700 pages.
I'm glad I asked the question. You know what to do.
I would say that he was reacting against his childhood and his perceived privilege and what he felt about it, and also the importance of nature in his childhood. It meant so much to him. He grew up largely in Stanford, and he spent his summers on Fisher's Island, so he's constantly surrounded by the natural world. So I think it's absolutely everyone's life is a reaction against their childhood, right? And I think that's a groundbreaking idea. But what was interesting to me is, some people, they grow up and they get a job and they just kind of have a pretty straightforward life, and Mathiessen's life is like this. It's constantly zigzagging and changing, and that's why it's as long as it is, because even in these last few years, people winding down, he was still writing books, so he was still writing 4 books at once, and yeah. Thank you so much.